Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today is Linda Peek Schacht from Lipscomb University. She's a former top aide to President Jimmy Carter, who was here in Nashville this week. Linda, President Carter came to Washington in January 1977 as sort of a breath of fresh air in politics, particularly after the Watergate scandal. 4 years later, he was defeated for re-election by Ronald Reagan. Do you believe, and at that time he left office, his popularity numbers were quite low, but you believe future historians will look back and see a different Jimmy Carter than the Jimmy Carter that looked to be the failed president after he left office?
I do. I think people remember the hostages, they remember long gas lines, they remember an economy that had baffled both Nixon and Ford, but I don't think they remember or know the many significant things that happened in that first term. And for instance, he appointed more women and people of color into top positions than the entire 38 presidents before him. He had conservation legislation that doubled the number of public parks, national parks that we have. His foreign policy, we know, created the Camp David Accords, which still protect Israel.
There's something There's something in particular that's in the news almost every day during this impeachment probe, and that's this whole Inspector General program.
That's right.
Those began under the Carter administration. This watchdog event in all the departments of government began under the Carter administration.
That's most important for today, and that was going to be my, kind of my last point. He promised people he would never lie to them. He promised that he would make a government as good as the American people. And part of that had to be bipartisan legislation, and he passed 70% of the bills that he sent to Congress. Bipartisan legislation that created the Inspector Generals, created the Special Counsel, passed a major ethics bill, including campaign finance reform. And so, yes, we're seeing the foundation of that today, in some ways being tested, but also we should be happy that we have those Inspector Generals.
After he was turned out of office in what turned out towards the end to be a fairly hard-fought and almost bitter election, why didn't President Carter just go back to Georgia, write his memoirs, and grow peanuts? Why did he continue to be involved in human rights activities, in voting activities across the world, and particularly in the Habitat ministry?
Because he was in his 50s. He knew he had a lot more to give. And as Hamilton Jordan once said, the difference in Jimmy Carter and the rest of us is he gets up every morning, and maybe we get up every morning saying we want to make the world a better place. The difference is Jimmy and Rosalind actually go out and do it. And I think one reason he wanted to do it was he had, there was a book following during his post-presidency called The Unfinished Presidency, and I thought some of the things that he's done, particularly in election reform around the world, reflect that. I mean, human rights was another thing that was really important to him, and it's something that's important for the Carter Center. He was the first president to name an assistant secretary for human rights, and there are people who believe his focus on human rights actually helped weaken the Soviet Union.
Dating all the way back to our first president, the father of our country, George Washington, there have been attacks on our president, but it seems to me in recent decades there has almost been a club sport that's been to basically malign and almost vilify our presidents, and this is on both sides of the aisle. What is that all about, and what does that say about the ability for the executive branch as one part of the government to continue to operate effectively if we continue to vilify all the men and maybe one day the women that occupy that post?
Well, polarization, cable TV, talk radio have all created such a divide in this country that we no longer, and there was a Pew poll recently, we no longer see ourselves first as male or female or southerner or northerner. We are, in any way, we see ourselves as Democrat and Republican or conservative and liberal, and that is a problem.
And we all live in our own little bubble. We basically live in the way we choose our media, the way we have our friends, the way we live our life, and within that bubble of things that we all tend to agree with and we're comfortable with. Does not also make it easier for the foreign countries who continue, the Russians in 2016, now perhaps the Chinese, along with the Russians and maybe other countries, to come in and manipulate our government because we're all so divided among ourselves and in all these little bubbles?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, countries do fall from within sometime, and I don't want to make that dire prediction, but the social media, which I didn't mention, is the most important place that disinformation starts, those conspiracy theories start, and then they spread much quicker. Well, Mark Twain said, you know, that a lie makes it around the world while the truth is still putting on its pants. So that's exactly what is happening with social media.
Well, as the truth puts on its pants, you also can notice over the years that former presidents all seem to tend to rise in stature and esteem and respect after they're out of office for a while. Even Herbert Hoover, who had to deal with the Great Depression when he left, by the time he died in the 1960s, people remembered what he was as a humanitarian, both after he left the White House and before. The same thing has happened, I think, with the Bushes, and it may happen with others. So there is some hope, perhaps, that people do, perhaps in history over time, has a different reading of what happens than what we may see instantaneously on the news or those first drafts of history and those books that come out right after they leave office.
Well, I think that's right. I think you'll see it also with Jimmy Carter. I think you're beginning to see it with President Carter. But in part because the things we've been talking about, that some of the things he put in place in terms of energy, he made it possible for more oil and gas deregulation here, so we could have domestic oil and
in airplane
energy.
Deregulation. People don't understand how they see all these flights that are available at our airport and others. It wasn't like that back
He
before
brought
the 70s.
air travel to the middle class by deregulating the airlines so that prices could go down.
Linda Peek Schacht's our guest. She's with Lipscomb University. She's also a former top aide to President Jimmy Carter, who was in town this week building homes for Habitat for Humanity. Stay with us on Inside Positive. We'll talk to Linda about 2020 politics and the presidential election after this break.